Alex's work never felt to me like a demonstration of facility. Rather, it always struck me as a material in service of narrative.
Hello and welcome to Alex Toth In Depth. This is Paul Fricke, cartoonist, comics professor, and Toth booster. This is the program where we discuss Toth's work and influence on comics, character design, and visual storytelling. Make sure to subscribe on YouTube or to the podcast. Check show notes for links. For daily Toth art posts, follow at Alex Toth In Depth on Instagram, and please spread the word. In discussion with us this episode is creator of the current Hey Kids comics, also known for American Flag, Black Kiss, Satellite Sam, and many others. He writes, he draws, he paints, and is a noted observer and analyst of Toth's work. Welcome, Howard Chaykin.
Hey, thanks, Paul. Thanks for having me, and thanks for having me on.
I really appreciate you taking the time. We met briefly many years ago when I was a fan of your American Flag work when it first started coming out. And before I broke in, I was trying to pitch something to First Comics, working on something with Brian Augustyn and Len Strazewski, and Willie Schubert inked my work, and we brought it to you, and you pretty much cut us off at the knees. It was hard to take at the time, your criticism, but you were right on every point.
There's nothing like being reminded of boyish cruelty. And thank you.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
I was talking to, recorded an episode recently with Tommy Edwards, and he said he got a similar critique from you. Did you ever receive a criticism of your work from Toth directly?
Oh, of course. Absolutely. Alex hated me and my work.
You guys had run-ins, yeah?
No, he was, he is, as I've said more than once, my favorite American comic book artist. There is no one better. He was also one of the most insufferable human beings I've ever known. And his behavior, his personality so completely informed it that I credit myself with far more grace and moral acuity than I might deserve by being able to separate the artist from the art.
Yeah, and you've mentioned you admire Gil Kane for doing the same.
Yes, well, and Gil had his own issues. Gil was a criminal, basically. Those of us who love Gil love him despite as opposed to because.
I'm just curious then, it seems like almost every one of your writings about Toth has to be prefaced with that about his personality.
Mm-hmm.
I hate to get into this in some fashion because that's not what the program's about, but
of course.
Is there any reason you mention it every time virtually?
Because I feel to a certain extent it's a flaw in his character that reduces his value and reduced the merit of his footprint. In the sense that it stood in the way of him producing work that might have been transcendent as opposed to simply beautiful. The quality of his work is profoundly influenced by the industrial designers of the 1930s and 1940s. And his translation of those ideas into comics is staggering. But there's a gap, there's a missing factor in there, which is to say the idea of doing work that had both narrative value, literary value, and visual value. There's visual value to his work that is transcendent. I still feel, I'm not going to use the word best. I'll say I will teach myself. I will tutor myself and say it's favorite. My favorite work of his remains the work that he did on the romance books at Standard in the 1950s. Mm-hmm. And that work is staggering in its visual beauty, and some of it is narratively clever as well. But it's puerile in its narrative,
right? And
his own sensibilities acted as a buffer and a filter that kept that work puerile and kept the work infantile and insipid. And that's just the way it is.
And that's true of, you think, of some of the work he wrote himself later.
Oh, yeah. Well, he was a terrible writer, just guessed.
Yeah.
But then again, very few of those guys were good writers. To his credit, Eisner was both a good writer and could identify a good writer. Kurtzman was as well. Woody couldn't write. Gil couldn't write. These guys were terrible. They wrote at their work as opposed to for it.
Right. I get you. And we'll get back to industrial design in a moment, but well, I want to go back to the beginning then. When you were a kid and you had seen his work in Eclipso, but also in Zoro, what exactly about his Zoro work? And you did specify a few things in the introduction to the collected Zoro. What about seeing Zoro then, as you say, made your brains fall out?
Well, I mean, one of the things we have to accept is that as children, when we first see work in comics, and most of us, I mean, I was introduced to comics at the age of 4. We react first to the material on the page because that's what's there. You know, we're not looking past it. We're not analyzing it. We're seeing it viscerally. And my visceral reaction to Toth's stuff on Zoro was that he managed to gather all of the romance that I felt that I loved in the television series and in swashbuckling films and put it on paper and do it in a way that was identifiable as beautiful. And what I found fascinating about it, as I get older, as I became an adult, Alex's work is so utterly modern that his capacity to produce period material is almost counterintuitive to the modernity of his work. And it works there. It works in his westerns, and it works in his historical pieces.
Right.
You know, I'd love to know how. I don't know whether he was. I'd love to know whether he was familiar with the Provinsons' works, the children's book illustrators, the Provinsons.
Yeah.
And because there are elements of, I mean, he drew more realistically, obviously, than they did. But there are elements of finish in a lot of his period material that catches some of that essence. The work after I sort of moved past looking at the work as brand and started looking at the work as in its execution. There's a transference of interest in my case, and I become much more interested in why he's doing it and how than what. And the problem remains that what he was doing wasn't very interesting. You know, I mean, the stories are stupid. I mean, in the review I did of the review of the first book, I compare him to Phil Spector in that, you know, he was able to take, you know, puerility and make it brilliant, but it remained puerile in its narrative.
Yeah, that's an apt comparison. I think you're on the mark with that. I'd like to talk a little bit about his early development. You've said that in 1950, I think with Battle Flag of the Foreign Legion, he became Alex Toth.
Right.
Some say that he applied lessons learned from the famous artist school materials.
Is that true? Was he involved in any way in that?
I don't think he was involved in it, but Jesse Ham, who passed in May 2021, has written that Toth got his hands on that material. I don't know when that was, late 40s, early 50s. There's some discrepancy on what the timing was. But I think you can, and Jesse points this out in a PDF called Ham on Toth that's still available.
If you would send that to me, I'd love to read it. I'd love to read that.
Yeah, I'll send you a link and make sure
Thanks.
you got it.
Thanks.
There's he points out some direct ties between some of the lessons and what he was able to produce, because as you said, his it's almost instant that you see some development in some of the earlier stories in 1950 where some of it's starting to pop out. You even see some of that in 49, maybe in some Green Lantern stuff and so on. But with Battle Flag, it's full flower. And I guess I'm curious what you think that development was. How did he become Toth just like that?
I don't know. I mean, one of the things that I found most fascinating is that the only other, I've said this publicly as recently as a week or so ago, that the only other artist I know who had so rapid a development from amateur to brilliance was Bernie Fuchs.
Yeah.
You see Fuchs's work in 3 years before he breaks out and basically wrests an automobile advertising account away from Austin Briggs. And the work is, you know, it's college level work. It's academically nothing special. And then all of a sudden he becomes Bernie Fuchs. And, you know, and the first iteration of Bernie Fuchs is very much an Austin Briggs take. In a way that Toth's work is very much a transliteration of Kniff and Sickles, and to a certain extent Robert Fawcett. Although in his later life he dismissed Fawcett.
Did he?
Basically, he felt that Fawcett was inconsistent in his perspective and his light sources.
Hmm.
But he was also he had a intense ability to rampage. The thing is, though, to a certain extent, I'd love to read that hand piece because I'd never didn't know it existed. The famous artist books, as I recall, were never released in that original in iteration, the Institute of Commercial Art Incorporated, which would have been timely in that era. I'm wondering whether he got hold of that stuff under the table. That would be possible. And I'd love to know whose lessons he absorbed, whether it would be someone like Fawcett or like Fred Ludekin's. Because you see, there's very little of Parker in his work. But there's a lot of Fawcett, there's a lot of Ludekin's. And the only place you see any of that Parker reference is the splash panels and the standard stuff.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to track that down. I'll make sure you get the him on.
I'd love to read that. I really would.
Yeah. So on industrial design, obviously he's applying the principles of industrial design to vehicles and cars and other things and planes and things he was interested in. But you're talking about too applying those principles to pretty much all of his work.
You know, I got into a discussion with Charles Hatfield a couple of years ago about the relative comparisons between Krigstein and Toth. And Toth's anti-intellectualism informed so much of his work. I described the work as sort of what, you know, they look like Paramount movies. Everybody looks like William Holden.
Right.
And I think that to a great extent, there's a heartlessness about Toth's work. And Gil always said that, you know, that his abstractions were what put the fans of people like Wallace Wood or Frank Frazetta or Neil Adams much more at ease than Toth's did. But also there's a chilliness about Toth's work. There's a coldness.
I've heard that people find his work cold and less engaging in some fashion.
But the fact is, I don't particularly need to be engaged, so I like this work. And I find that his abstractions are, for me, banal. You know, his faceless tap dancer, and you know, to a certain extent, there's one of the things that interferes with him as a writer is that he tends to the twee, and he jumping off of the Torpedo books struck me as a very significant bit of business. In that, you know, he found it impossible to do stories about a character who was so clearly insufferable and horrible. He was a bad guy. I mean, that's it. Right. And I find that, you know, that sort of mindset, that sort of sensibility verges on the ridiculous. I like the idea of relating to material on the basis of its execution. I just, you know, I'm not, the subject matter of material doesn't interest me as much as how it's executed. I'm a pretty left-wing guy, and as much as I despair at some of the shittiness that comes out of the Comicsgate crowd, I'd be perfectly happy to see a well-made, well-written, and well-drawn right-wing comic book that spoke completely against everything I stood for politically and socially. I'm willing to accept some execution in the name of ideology. You know, so the two things tend to work together.
On the subject of coldness, I get what people say. Sometimes when he crops too tightly on a face, or he's just meeting a deadline and he's experimenting with those things, it doesn't work. But in other ways, he handles things and approaches things in ways that don't feel cold to me at all, where people would think that it's distancing. Like there's a story, a DC horror story called Double Edge, and in it there's a stepmother with like a beauty mark above her lip. And at one point, she grabs this kid by the ear. And I think most comics artists, when handling a panel like that, would show the kid's face and show the stepmom and get the emotion of that scene across in a more straightforward manner. And in that panel, Toth instead has an intense crop, and it's from the rear. So all we see is the stepmom's fingers on the kid's earlobe, and that is a less direct way to approach it than I think most comic artists would do it. But I feel that it's not cold at all, and I feel the pinch of that that finger on the ear far more than how it would be traditionally approached.
Well, it's also, I mean, here's me thinking graphically. One of the things about the shape and image you described is that the shape of fingers and the shape of an ear lend themselves to the obsessive geometry, which he loves so much.
Right.
It's one of the things that's happened in my career working in the early '80s. I felt I'd reached a point where I was able to decode and decipher a lot of what was being done by artists like Robert Fawcett, to a lesser extent Noel Sickles. But Fawcett's design system had a mathematical quality to it that I feel I deciphered in the early '80s. And it changed the way I approach picture making and page making dramatically. And to a great extent, Alex's work is about patterns informed by the organic, and the idea of creating geometric patterns in which action and form and character behavior can be planted. That is one of the elements of his work that continues to intrigue me. The superficial nature of the way he chooses to render. There are a number of Toth websites, Toth fan groups and stuff. And they all talk about being influenced by Alex Toth. And being influenced by Alex Toth is not drawing like Alex Toth. It's learning to understand his thought processes. That's what the influence comes in. And what Toth was about shape and overlap and pattern and the recreation of space through that implication of shape. And drawing like him is not imitating him. Drawing like him is mimicking him. There are a lot of guys out there who have adopted certain of his techniques, but unless you deal with the technique from within, which is to say the organization of space by pattern and shape, you're not really doing anything other than imitating the way you render shape.
Yeah, that was my next question, actually. So you lap me on that. That's great. That said, there are elements in your work where I think there are more direct Toth influences. I guess maybe I first saw it in The Shadow.
Yes.
Where more surface elements
yes.
that comes across. Do you feel you've learned from his work and applied it in a more direct fashion sometimes?
Oh, absolutely. I feel that to a great extent. I'm working on a book now. I'm doing a sequel to a series that I did for Dark Horse a couple of years ago, to no recognition whatsoever, utter indifference on the part of the audience, called Marked Man. And there's an enormous application of his techniques in there. I would say that the three most important influences in my professional working life are Alex Toth, Wallace Wood, and John Severin. My work, to a great extent, is a conflation of those three guys. Severin is always the surprise to people.
It is to me. I wouldn't have guessed it, but having revisited some of your work, more recent work, I see it now that you say it.
There's a sense of casual characterization about the work that derives a great deal from Severin. And the fact that all three had something like a relationship with Harvey Kurtzman, and that they all adapted in their own work technique derived from Kurtzman. Despite Kurtzman's disdain for Woody and anger at Toth for the way he approached the material.
Right.
But the Kurtzman influence, the Kurtzman, what Kurtzman taught us to a great extent, and which some applied and some didn't, was the concept of formalizing an order. And I really, to a great extent, Toth's work works best for me when it has that formalism. I'm very much, the older I've gotten, the more formal I've become. I used to be all over the place with layout, and now I'm so anally retentive and obsessive about my organization on a page that I become crotchety and stodgy by certain standards. That said, I look at Toth's work, and for me, the most successful stuff, as I said, is the standard work, because it's very organized and it has a very strong sense of pattern. Not the war stuff, but the romance stuff, and of course, Crush Gardenia. You know, there's a sense of pattern both visually in terms of the panel by panel breakdown in the panel itself and on the pages as well. One of the things that people forget in comics today, to a great extent, is that the page as a unit of space representing time. And the fact is, Toth, whether intellectually or instinctually, understood that. And his narrative, his acting, is so deeply informed by movies that he saw from the time that he was a little boy until he really stopped growing in the late 40s, early 50s. He continued to grow visually, but narratively his tastes really atrophied. And he would have been a perfect match for all these people today, grown men and women, reading children's books, reading Harry Potter as if it's an adult piece of fiction. I mean, that sort of thing.
Right.
That kind of faux innocence that is such utter bullshit.
I've read, I've watched a video or two of you, of your lessons about storytelling and page breakdown and all that, proscenium march, all that kind of thing. That's interesting to me in regards to, I wonder, some of what you're saying, you're more formal as you go. Does an approach like that sometimes become more formulaic? Because when I look at Toth's layouts over his career, certainly there are comics where it's more organized and confined, like you say, with the romance standard stuff, and with 6-panel grids for Dell and other things. But then there's other layouts where he is more open and inventive and experimental. Do you find that becoming more formal gives one more of a hook to do the work at hand, or do you admire like how he tried to keep mixing it up?
Well, one of the things about Toth's work is the older he gets, the flatter his work becomes. And it's not from the rendering, but he seems to lose his interest in deep space. And I mean, the last really strong example of his work in demonstration of deep space is probably that Hot Wheels drop he did. Most of the work, a lot of the work he did in the last 25 years of his life was very flat and graphic and very poster based, derived from posters. I, on the other hand, as I've gotten older, have become obsessed with the concept of deep space, and I really, really feel that it is a factor of the work we do that is woefully underused. And some years back, when I was doing the Marvel seminars, I was doing this collaborating with Carlos Jansen, and we both tried to excoriate these 5 guys who were yelling at, just telling you this is not, there's no motion. We are a static as opposed to a plastic medium. And Klaus and I both simultaneously, but of course there's always deep space. And it was like, whoa, we had that dog sarcasm moment, and began to realize that there were opportunities there, and I've been exploring those opportunities dramatically. And a lot of those explanations showed up in those paradigms you talked about, because I really have come to believe that one of the ways you can apply Illustrator's technique to what we do in comics is to organize material to frame and use foreground shape to define action. And a lot of that led me back to Joe Kubert to a great extent, because Kubert was a master of that. Kubert really had a great sense of deep space, and he used it very effectively, particularly in the NEA stuff. And it was just an extraordinary piece of work there. And there's a resonance between Kubert's work and Toth's work, and they're contemporaries, and
a Morton Meskin influence there too for both.
what was weird is it took me many, many years to appreciate Meskin. Gil always talked about Meskin. My pal Dave Armstrong, you know Dave, of course, always talked about Meskin. And I never saw it because the only stuff I saw was the late stuff. And lately, Dave has been posting Meskin's Vigilante splashes, which are absolutely breathtaking. They're staggeringly good. The material I remember seeing it because I had a run of Action, and Vigilante was a backup feature there. But it never registered on me as an adolescent golden age collector. But the work is extraordinary. There's a richness to it. Erwin Hazen also used to hammer me. You got to be looking at Mort. You got to be looking at so yeah, that stuff. But there's that period when all these guys come out of the scene as children, and they all become themselves in the early 50s. And Gil was the least of the crew. He started out imitating Jack, and then he was imitating Alex, and he did Dan Barry, and he finally became himself, oddly enough, under the tutelage of the insufferable Vern Hogarth. And he's the only guy I know who was able to take what he needed and leave the rest when it came to Hogarth. Because Hogarth was a dreadful influence on so many of us.
He was for me. I got my hands on those anatomy books when I was a teen, and it took me probably 5 years to unlearn that stuff.
Oh, it's just great. But Gil actually combining what Hogarth did and what he learned from the Bridgman books, he really made it work. But Toth, was always about shape, not about form. And the guys that Toth got it from, they were all doing Kniff back then, and Gil wasn't good enough to do that stuff. The thing is, you look at Toth's work, and again, the Battle Flag is there. I mean, you can also see the progression over the Sierra Smith stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Just it becomes something else, something other than what's going on. It becomes decorative without being attention-gettingly decorative, if you will. The way the Meskin stuff is. The Meskin stuff, the splashes and those covers are very decorative, and they're very much they're demonstration of facility. Alex's work never felt to me like a demonstration of facility. Rather, it always struck me as a material in service of narrative. Whether successfully or whether the narrative was worth that service is another question entirely. Right.
Well, and I love that formulation that you've got there, and I think you've employed it. There's the very first page of American Flag I still show to my students, because if you look at that page, and I did this because I was such a Flag fan. We met one other time. I got a Flag sketch from you that maybe was when the second issue came out, and we chatted while you drew it. And I raved about one page in particular, and you said that was the only one that Kane had just looked at and said didn't work. Now when I look at it, I'm like, oh yeah, it doesn't work. It's a little too, it's not easy to follow. But I was so impressed with people trying to break the typical flow of a page and still make it work. And I applauded you for that. But when I look at like page 1, if you just take that in graphically, there's a lot going on, and it can be a little confusing. But the more I looked at it, the more all the fundamentals of storytelling are there. Long shot, closer, all the way through. It's very traditional in its construction, but then you've got a different layer on top of it graphically, and that is graphic design and service and narrative, and you keep pulling it off. And hopefully my students are grasping it when I show them that page.
But I doubt they are, because it gets in the way of the fun, to a certain extent. I mean, the comic book the comic book page as an element of creativity is unfortunately cursed with an audience of hobbyists who frequently are under the impression that it is a natural act, that it simply exists organically. And the disavowal of a vocabulary, of a language, of a syntax in this context is vast and huge. It unnerves me to see how many people just get up in the morning one day and say, "Hey, I think I'm going to be a graphic novelist." You know, that's as if it's just something that you can do by will. And that amateurism is part and parcel a part of the dismissal of expertise and the aversion to the actual learning of a language. And I believe comics is a valid language that is frequently unspoken. So
what do you mean by unspoken?
Well, you've got a lot of people out. I mean, one of the things that started the paradigm has its sources in a series of lectures that I gave, first with Klaus and then on my own at Marvel over in the early aughts for about 7 years straight, twice a year, in which they had guys who drew beautifully, drew cleverly, but who couldn't put a page together worth a shit, because the model, the dynamic of making comic books was when my generation was the third generation. There's a mini generation that was born between 38 and 40, Neil and Serenko and that crowd. And then my generation comes along, the earliest is 46, and then moving on. And you had to live in New York City because you had to basically be there available for work when work showed up. When a decade later, you didn't have to live in New York anymore. You lived everywhere because Federal Express and now digital took over the marketplace. Mm-hmm. And one of the results of not having that centralized place to work was you had no idea what the process was for the work being created. So the first day after we beat the hobbyism out of these guys was to try to convey to them that there was a deliberateness called for in comics. That a panel was not simply a frame wrapped around a bunch of figures hanging around, that the material had to have narrative value, that a picture, a comic book page, had to convey some acting. And for the most part, the only kind of acting that the average comic book reader likes is grimacing and overdramatic behaviors. I watched the Douglas Fairbanks version of The Three Musketeers last night, 1921 silent picture. Mm-hmm. And I was struck by being reminded of just how much acting and a number of the people in the film, not including Fairbanks, but Adolphe Menjou played Louis, and Eugene Pallette played Aramis. That these actors, how much they had to subsume their instincts for mime when they became sound actors. And comics has an enormous resonance with both kabuki and no theater, silent film, and pornography, and pornographic films, in that it is very much based on emblematic and symbology. And these guys had no capacity to deliver anything that looked like a picture that had acting and narrative value that wasn't grimacing or overdoing a dramatic moment. And yet they couldn't create characterization out of simple human gesture. I mean, I've told the story more than once. A couple of years back, I was on a panel at a convention, and I was sharing it with two guys who just done a book that sounded in description very interesting. And I bought the trade paperback of 5 issues in a collection. And in 5 issues, the characters in this book all looked alike. None of them seemed to have anything physically to do with their bodies other than stand and talk to each other. And most significantly, in 5 issues, there wasn't a single panel in which a character in the book in a close-up was directly identified with the reader. That created a connection to the reader as participant in the material. The reader is the engine of the material. The reader is there to turn the page. And you turn the page because it's objective about involvement, in my opinion.
Oh, you mentioned acting. What's so great about Toth's acting? Like the body language, the expressions, what about it and how he approaches it is so, I don't know. It just seems different and better than just about anybody.
It's because of his training in romance comics. That's where it's at. I mean, romance comics depend on precisely that skill set. And I gave up only recently, back when there was still a Vertigo at DC Comics, and trying to convince Vertigo Comics to reinstate the romance line, to do a real modern love book, and to move past the crass bullshit that had been the material in its time, but to move into something that was a reflection of what Amazon is doing with that miniseries of Modern Love, without any success. And my generation was the one that dismantled the romance comics lines in DC for the most part, because they, the guys who came in and replaced the dying editors were guys who had no relationships with women and didn't know how to talk to women. And they weren't interested in female readership. They were interested in doing adolescent power fantasy comics, and that's what they've done. But Alex's romance comics remain the pinnacle of his work. They're brilliant. They're truly gorgeous. They're clever.
And he really loved those too, just because of the emotion and the subtleties that he could get across.
Yeah, I mean, it's transcendent work. I mean, I love the 3 jobs he did for Harvey. I truly do. I mean, Dying City, Saberjet, and Thunderjet in particular, of course, is staggering. But again, it's one of those rare examples where he's really involved in deep space. But I think, as someone pointed out, he still gets all melodramatic in that last shot, overdoing the heroism.
When I'm looking at your prototypical protagonist, which some have said there's a similarity, right, with Flag, and then others you've done.
It's all played by the same guy.
Right. But I see, like, tell me if I'm wrong, but I see some Buzz Sawyer, Roy Crane faces in that, and I see the Australian Code Mystery faces and the Thunderjet.
No question. Well, but because we're both obsessed with the same guys.
Yeah.
I mean, let's face it. Alex did a phenomenal James Garner when he drew Maverick.
Right.
And my hero is based on a conflation prototype of William Holden, Henry Fonda, and James Garner. Who reflect an aspect of mid 20th century American masculinity at its best. It's that look. And I owe a great deal of that to the fact that I share an enthusiasm with Alex in that regard.
Interesting. There's nothing wrong with an archetype,
no,
actually.
I love comics. It's all about archetype.
Well, you mentioned Maverick too, and I'm thinking of the Tonto coloring book he did. You said something on Facebook that struck me. Somebody posted an original from that coloring book, and with the original you can see a lot of whiteout in there, and then you said, and then you see all the whiteout and realize how that effortlessness is an illusion. And most people, when they're using whiteout, are trying to clean things up and make it more pristine and make it more perfect. And if you look at that Tonto drawing in particular, he's actually using the whiteout to rough it up and make it look more more naturalistic, right? With a rougher brush or an edge to the line that isn't super clean. Why did he go to those lengths to get that kind of look?
Well, it brings to mind what Fred Tarabod called, when Step by Step magazine was still a thing. Fred did a monthly, an issue by issue column called "The Lessons from the Masters," which he collected in a book shortly thereafter. And his essay about Earl Oliver Hearst, that great, guy who was an Esquire cartoonist, a commercial magazine illustrator, an advertising illustrator, and then ultimately a children's book artist, and as well as an essayist at the American Artist magazine. The title of that piece was Earl Oliver Hearst and the Illusion of Spontaneity.
Right.
And I think that defines Alex's work in a nutshell. Alex's work is there to convey the idea that he just tossed it off. And and it's just there's an elegant inevitability about the pictures he makes. That is what sells the material to me.
That's amazing. By the way, everybody, I would urge you to pick up a book, a collection of Hearst work. I think you wrote the intro for that too, right?
I did.
And that's spot on. That is something. There's so many people whose work looks like Toth, or people that influenced him. And there's something about his work where it just seems, like you said, inevitable, but in the pocket. It's not too tight. It's not too loose. Most of the time throughout his career, it's right in that sweet spot. I see it on that Treasures Retold cover.
Yeah.
You love that one too, I recall.
Oh,
What's so great about that one? I love it. I know what I love about it, but what do you love about that?
it's just like it's like 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 it says in Jim Dandy to the Rescue. That's right, of course. There's no other way to think about it. I mean, Neil Adams always insisted there was no such thing as a throwaway panel, and it's not really true, but I have a commitment to making that true. And Alex's work never feels as if there's a throwaway. That stream of guys from the attempt to do John Fury, the Bravo for Adventure, the John Fury stuff. The way those fucking boots are fucking rendered, for Christ's sake! I mean, oh my God, it kills me. It makes my heart explode. I love it so much. The way those hands just point and just and then of course it's undercut by the banality of the characterization. It's hysterical. Fifi, I mean, get out of here with this shit. Frou, Zuzu. I mean, come on, man. Just imagine if he'd actually worked with a writer with some depth. For Christ's sake, it kills me.
Yeah, it's few and far between. Some things of his work I think stand up, but a lot of it I read because I have to understand the storytelling.
Right.
But it's tough to read in terms of the content. Every once in a while, certain things rise above. But that Treasures Untold cover is just gorgeous. One could just stare at that and pick it apart and learn from it and emulate it and have everything you need to know. It reminds me of a comment you made when I showed you my work. You were like, "Where do you learn how to draw shoes like that? Where do you learn how to draw feet that foot into shoes like that?" And I was like, "He's right. All right. I got to get better."
I mean, when I find myself in a hole, speaking of drawing shoes, I go to Ken Reilly. Okay. Ken Reilly is one of those guys who's not really acknowledged in the A-list of that era. But one has to remember that in the mid 20th century golden age, the second golden age of American illustration, even the average was extraordinary. And I have tear sheets of Reilly's illustrations for the Reader's Digest condensed book adaptation of The Last Angry Man. And there are these drawings of this guy sitting on a bench. And the shoes are graphically brilliant. They're so perfectly realized, and there's nothing there. You go from Toth to Reilly to Kevin Nolan. The way Kevin Nolan can do a brogue like a motherfucker. I mean, it just kills me. I feel like I'm hapless in comparison. And I like drawing shoes as opposed. When I was, I love the fact that what we used to draw when we drew Batman and Superman in their costumes, they were basically wearing socks, and now of course Batman's got these cleats on his boots and shit, and it's just ridiculous. The attempt to make realistic out of what is basically circus stuff is absurd.
Yeah, I'm with you there. In some of that is a Miller influence, and some of it is the trying to make realistic, like you say, and dark, right? And some of that is movie influence bouncing back onto comics.
Well, as I said yesterday, you've got an entire audience of comic book readers who are probably wondering whether they can get an AARP discount, still complaining about this shit. I was a Superman and Batman enthusiast until I discovered the Silver Age material of the reintegration of superheroes, the Green Lantern stuff, and particularly Hawkman. That I remember buying that for not me buying, my pal Michael Perricone buying that first issue of Brave and Bold featuring Kubert's revival of Hawkman with Gardner Fox, which reading that script today is like, holy shit, this stuff is terrible. But I love that book so much. I was 10. It was like, oh my God, it's fabulous. And I became a Golden Age collector when I was about 12 or 13. And then I sold my Golden Age stuff for ECs, and I ultimately sold my ECs for drugs. But the ECs I was buying were the science fiction books. And I love those science fiction books enormously. But as I got older, the work that appealed to me the most was first the Kurtzman stuff, then Woody stuff on Shock Suspense, and then Crime Suspense with Johnny Craig. And they were formulaic, they were silly, they were pointless, but they were also, particularly in Kurtzman's case, and to a lesser extent in Craig's case. They were perfect transliterations of medium and format. And Kurtzman's work on the war books was brilliant and just extraordinary. And to this day, I realized when I read Jim Thompson's work in the early 80s that the visual that was in my head was Wallace Wood's Urban Decay in those liberal hysteria comics that he did for Shock Suspense.
Oh.
I love that work enormously. And I look to my left, and to my left is the collection of Pictofictions. And one of the great revelations of the Pictofiction stuff was the fact that Reed Crandall, who was so traditional an illustrator in his time, who I believe, was one of the three great cover artists working in comics ever. His run on Blackhawk and Military, and then later, Military, and then, later Police Comics, is an absolute achievement in the 1940s, equaled only by Kurtzman's work on the war books in the 1950s, and then now by Dave Johnson and everything he does. I believe that Johnson is the cover artist in comics. And there's him and there's everybody else. But in those Pictofiction romance books, Crandall demonstrates an understanding of the kind of graphics that were being done in the slicks at the time. I just recently pre-ordered the Fantagraphics collection of the Charlie Byron Topps books, and I'm looking forward to that enormously for the same reason. That stuff has enormous appeal to me.
If you think what's present in the EC stuff is lacking largely in more current comics,
yes.
How do you think that current comics creators can take the lead from the EC stuff done 70 years ago, and then apply it to a newer stuff to raise the bar?
They can't. Because anyone with any ambition in mainstream comics is forced by circumstance to filter that ambition through the screen of superhero stories. And
what about non-mainstream stuff? What about in other genres? You're not a fan
that's
of
what I'm doing.
Indie stuff?
That's what I'm doing. To a certain extent, Ed Brubaker does that with his crime books. That's what I've been doing for years. Mark Mann is very much a reflection of that sort of thing, as is Hey Kids. I'm not interested in the least in superhero material. I'll do it occasionally because, frankly, it's my job. But what the code did was to obviate anything other than mostly superhero narrative, because the audience it's what it wants. And the idea of I'm competing with an audience that is dazzled by pyrotechnics and Toth. And one of the reasons that Toth never achieved the kind of universal appreciation and love that guys like Jack Kirby did is that he has no pyrotechnics in him. He's not interested in pyrotechnics. He's interested in intimate moments. The same is true of Kriegstein.
Right.
But Kriegstein's idea is utterly the antithesis of Alex's. Alex is a romantic sheen as seen through a Paramount scrim, whereas Kriegstein has more in common with Sergei Eisenstein, if you're going to apply a film reference to it.
Yeah.
Down. And I admire them both, and I adore them both. And Kriegstein's work was certainly cold as shit, but it also was physically beautiful.
It's beautiful.
In a way that is different, but commensurate to Alex's.
And they were no doubt seeing each other during those early formative years.
I would suspect they didn't like each other very much. I would go out on a limb and say that's probably likely.
Some of that kind of stuff you get to in Hey Kids comics. I find it fascinating, the world you're building and how you're doing it. But why the preoccupation with the comics industry? Is it just good content to riff off of, or do you know it well? Or
I spend a great deal of time hanging out with the old guys because I like hearing what they have to say, and the great bitterness that came off those conversations was stuck with me. And I worked for Gil Kane. I got to know Gil really well, and through Gil, I got to meet Russ. And Frank Giacoya, Alex, all these old guys, and I felt that there was a story to be told, because one of the swarms of bullshit that accrues to what Stan did was that we're all a bunch of comic book loving guys. One of the reasons that people constantly call me Howie is because Stan introduced this idea that we're all just comic book loving guys with nicknames. Fuck you, get the hell out of here with that shit. It's just nonsense. And the truth is, there was a story to be told. There were anecdotes. And as I've said more than once, a lot of it didn't ever happen, but it's all true anyway. Nobody ever hung an editor out of a window. That never happened. It just never happened, trust me. But it's too good a story not to tell. You know? I was talking with my editor on the phone yesterday because what's coming up next is our third and final volume of 8 Kids. And it's about fandom. And it's about the appreciation of the material. And there's a story that's true. I happened to be in the office at Marvel. And I ran into Gil. And the pencils for that Avengers annual had just come in. The one that Michael inked, the Michael Golden pencil that Armando Gil inked.
Right.
And I'm watching Gil. Gil's looking at these pages. And I'm watching Gil begin to boil in rage. Just absolute rage. And I say, what? And he says, how the fuck does he do this? He says to me. And we're trying to figure out a way to convey that in Hey Kids Comics.
Gotcha.
And we're going back and forth on whether, is it something we see or we don't see, and that sort of thing. And, you know, Gil, for all of his faults, and he had lots of faults, was still deeply capable of both appreciating and learning from what came after him, which is not true of a lot of those old guys. You know, and I also hold in a certain detachment that comics will break your heart, kid, or Wallace Wood's feeling about comics. You know, like Super Chicken said to Fred, you knew the job was dangerous when you took it. So much of the bitterness that accrued to those guys really derived to a certain extent from an assumption that those rules that everybody's getting fucked by, they won't apply to me. You know, and the fact is the rules apply to everybody. You know, you can't. You know, I pointed out recently that I knew a lot of people back in the 80s who were willing to vote for Ronald Reagan for his financial policies, not for his social policies, if you could isolate your vote. And, you know, you like I say, you knew the job was dangerous when you took it. You know, comics is a calling. It has as much to do with Jesuitry as it does with a career and anything else. And and I'm a comic book man. My wife, you know, my beautiful wife, has been trying to get me to write a novel for years. And I said, I'm not a novelist. I'm a comic book man. You know, that's what I do. You know, I see narrative in terms of comic book pages. It's how I'm a raconteur. I'm good in the room. I'm a, you know, when I was a drinking man, I was a great storyteller at a bar. Now I'm just a buzzkill. But the truth is, you know, I like narrative. I like story, and I like the formulation of story. And back to your first question, what informs Hey Kids is my understanding of the value of anecdote. And so much of that first volume of Hey Kids is anecdotal. The second volume is to a great extent the resonance and results of those anecdotes, how things evolve. Okay. And it's a story worth telling, in my opinion. I think those guys were, you know, I stand on the shoulders of those men and women. I mean, when I met Gil Kane when I was 13, I met Gil Kane at 13 in a bookstore in Brooklyn, and I shit myself, not literally but figuratively. You know, he's a god. He's just like, oh my God, he makes the things that inform my life. That's where it's at. You know?
And did he call you my boy?
He did.
Hello, my boy.
He did. When I found out where that came from, I was delighted.
Uh-oh. Do I want to know?
Came from Symphony Sid. Symphony Sid was a disc jockey in the 1940s and 50s. I grew up listening to him as well. He was on WEBD, the station that speaks your language. By the time I was listening to him live, actually as an adult, he was doing a phonetic Spanish show. He spoke no Spanish, but he did a Latin record show that he delivered as his spiel in phonetic Spanish. Here's your boy, Symphony Sid. And that's where the My Boy comes from, because Gil was that one of those, you know, progressive beboppers in the late 1940s.
Wow. Yeah, I didn't know. He called me my boy probably 10 times when I had him do a sketch at the same con I had you do.
He was too narcissistic to remember anybody's name.
It's like Buddy and Guy, right?
Exactly. I'm that guy. Look, I'm that guy now. I'm like, hey Guy, how are you? You know, it's right. Well, look, I'm an old man. Shit slips, man. You know, come on. I'm 71 years old, and you know, and I'm still functioning. But there's some functions that just don't. Some functions don't hit the junction, if you will. You know?
Yeah. Well, I feel the same way as you. I think narratively and in the language of comics as well. I hope in 10 years of teaching at the Minneapolis College of Art and Design, most of the students are not into um, uh, superhero genre. I would say almost none, and most of them do consider it a calling. Whether they can persevere with knowing what it's like to get into it, we'll see, right? But I still hold a degree of hope that the new generations and the current generation are going to produce some good stuff.
Well, as we collapse into an authoritarian state, these guys may very well be the linchpin of samizdat. You know, is there comics dot? Maybe it's comics dot. That's what it's about. But then again, you're dealing with you're dealing with a constituency that doesn't know what samizdat is. You have to teach them that first.
We'll see how it plays out. If someone now is coming upon Toth's work anew, and they're looking to learn from his stuff or improve their work, what 2 or 3 elements, wrapping up, or aspects of Toth's work do you think that they would learn from and can apply?
Look at the way his characters act. Look at the way his figures overlap, and look at the way they interact visually from in a graphic sensibility. There is a unity to Alex's work that is just staggering. And avoid and get past the need for pyrotechnics and look at intimacy.
That's great. Short and to the point. Simple, he would approve, and I appreciate you taking time again to talk Toth and comics and everything else on the program, Howard. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks, Paul. I mean, again, this is an absolute gas. I had no idea how much fun this would be because I never expect fun. I expect gruesome, but when fun shows up, it's a treat. Okay, thanks again.
Yeah. Everyone, make sure you catch up and pick up Hey Kids comics.
Yeah, the trade paperback will be out next week. The volume 2 trade paperback will be out next week. It's called Profits and Loss, and it's a lot about EC comics to a certain extent.
Yeah, I haven't picked up those in issue by issue, but I'm looking forward to the trade. I urge everyone to do the same.
The trade has some back matter featuring a character who is oddly resonant with me, named Noah Gitlin, which are kind of funny and kind of awful. Have a great day, Paul. Thanks again.
I really appreciate it. Thanks, Howard. That's all the time we're giving to this episode. This again is Paul Fricke for the Alex Toth In Depth program. Remember what Toth said: harsh criticisms by pros can and do help. We re-examine our pen and ink doodling through others' eyes, and at last get to really see what we'd missed before. Bitter but curative, purgative medicine. Until next time, go with Toth.